Flight attendant Heather Bailey glares at Isaiah and Zoe Montgomery, demanding they move from first class. The couple silently exchange knowing glances. The captain emerges, his face draining of color as he recognizes them. They don't just belong in first class. They own this entire airline. Before we dive into this incredible story, where are you watching from today? Hit that like button and subscribe if you've ever witnessed or experienced discrimination while traveling. The way this flight attendant's attitude completely transforms when she discovers who she's really talking to will leave you speechless. Isaiah Montgomery adjusted his simple gray cashmere sweater as he settled into his first-class seat aboard Pinnacle Airways Flight 2187 to Chicago. Nothing about his understated designer clothes or his wife Zoe's elegant but casual attire screamed wealth or power. And that was exactly the point. Nervous? Zoe whispered, squeezing his hand. Her dark eyes sparkled with anticipation beneath her naturally curly hair, styled in a subtle updo. Not nervous. Just ready, Isaiah replied, his voice low. 3 months of ownership, and this is our first real look at how things actually operate. The Montgomerys hadn't publicly announced their acquisition of Pinnacle Airways yet. The paperwork had been finalized quietly through holding companies and subsidiaries of their primary business, Montech. The revolutionary AI security firm Isaiah had built from nothing. Their plan was simple: experience their airline as ordinary passengers before revealing themselves to the staff and implementing the sweeping changes they envisioned. Isaiah's journey to this moment had been anything but straightforward. Growing up in Chicago's South Side, he'd navigated a childhood marked by economic hardship and systemic barriers. His single mother, a hospital nurse working double shifts, had instilled in him an unshakable work ethic and a belief that education was his ticket to something better. That belief had carried him through a scholarship to MIT, where his brilliant mind had flourished despite the isolation of often being the only black student in advanced computing classes. It was there, in his junior year, that he'd conceived the core algorithm that would eventually become Montech's foundation. An AI security system that could identify threats without the racial biases that plague traditional security software. Beside him, Zoe Montgomery was a force in her own right. With 3 advanced degrees in aerospace engineering and 7 patents to her name, she'd revolutionized fuel efficiency systems before joining forces with Isaiah both professionally and personally. The daughter of Jamaican immigrants, she'd fought her own battles in the predominantly white, male aerospace industry, where her ideas were often dismissed until proven undeniable. Together, they'd built Montech into a billion-dollar enterprise, but they'd never forgotten the discrimination they'd faced along the way. The airline acquisition wasn't just a business move, it was personal. "Excuse me," Zoe quietly signaled to a passing flight attendant, a young man with Kevin Garcia on his name tag. "Could we get some water before takeoff?" Kevin nodded politely but continued down the aisle, serving 2 white passengers their requested champagne before returning to the galley without bringing the Montgomerys their water. Isaiah and Zoe exchanged glances but said nothing, mentally logging the interaction. The first-class cabin was filling up now. Most passengers nodded politely or simply ignored others as they found their seats. A few gave the Montgomerys curious or surprised glances, a familiar experience for the couple in luxury spaces. 20 minutes after boarding began, a commotion erupted at the front of the cabin. A tall, silver-haired white man in an expensive suit was arguing loudly with another flight attendant. "I always sit in 2A on this route." "It's basically my seat," he insisted, gesturing dismissively toward where Isaiah and Zoe were sitting. "Those people must have made a mistake." The flight attendant he was speaking to, Heather Bailey according to her name tag, was a thin woman in her mid-40s with a pinched expression and bleached blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun. She'd been with Pinnacle Airways for 15 years, as they'd learned during their research phase. She also had a history of passenger complaints, particularly from minority travelers who reported dismissive treatment and selective enforcement of rules. "Let me handle this, Mr. Wilson," Heather said, her voice performatively professional as she approached the Montgomerys. Without making eye contact, she addressed them in a tone one might use for small children. There seems to be some confusion about seating. Mr. Bradley Wilson always flies in these seats. I'm going to need to see your boarding passes. Isaiah calmly pulled up the digital passes on his phone. There's no confusion. We're in 2A and 2B, exactly as assigned. Heather barely glanced at the boarding passes before replying, well, there must have been a mistake in the system. Mr. Wilson is one of our most valued executive platinum members. Our tickets are confirmed, Zoe said firmly. We booked these specific seats weeks ago. Bradley Wilson stepped closer, looking down at them with poorly concealed disdain. Look, I'm sure there are perfectly fine seats in economy. This is really a simple matter of respecting customer loyalty. Several nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably. One middle-aged woman across the aisle pretended to be absorbed in a magazine while actually watching the interaction intently. Another passenger, a younger man, had discreetly begun recording the exchange on his phone. Perhaps you'd be more comfortable in the economy section, Heather suggested to the Montgomerys, not bothering to hide the condescension in her voice. I can find you seats together there. Isaiah maintained perfect composure, his expression neutral despite the familiar sting of the situation. We're in our assigned seats with confirmed first-class tickets. There's no reason for us to move. Heather's smile tightened. Sir, I'm trying to accommodate a valued customer. Your uncooperative attitude is becoming disruptive. Under the tray table, Zoe had taken out her phone and was sending a text message to Marcus Chen, the Executive Vice President of Operations at Pinnacle, and one of the few people aware of the Montgomery's ownership. Nearby, Kevin Garcia observed the situation with growing discomfort. He'd witnessed similar scenes before, but something about the quiet dignity of the couple made him particularly uneasy about Heather's behavior. Still, as a relatively new hire, he hesitated to intervene. If you continue to be difficult, Heather said, her voice dropping to a threatening whisper, I'll be forced to call security. We can't have passengers disrupting the boarding process. Bradley Wilson smirked, certain of his imminent victory. He checked his Rolex ostentatiously and sighed. I'd really like to get settled before my important call at takeoff. Heather straightened up. I'll take care of this right away, Mr. Wilson. She pulled out the cabin phone and spoke quietly but deliberately. Security to gate 27, please. Disruptive passengers in first class. The tension in the cabin was palpable as passengers awaited the approaching confrontation, completely unaware of the shocking revelation about to unfold. As security was summoned to gate 27, the atmosphere in the first-class cabin crackled with tension. Heather Bailey stood with arms crossed, a victorious smirk playing at the corners of her mouth. Bradley Wilson had taken a seat across the aisle, scrolling through his phone with an air of entitled impatience. This is completely unnecessary, Zoe said, her voice level despite her rising indignation. Years of corporate boardrooms had taught her to control her tone, showing anger would only reinforce the stereotypes people like Heather and Bradley already believed about black women. Ma'am, the decision has been made, Heather replied with exaggerated patience. Security will escort you to economy or off the plane entirely. Your choice. Isaiah remained silent, his face impassive but his mind meticulously recording every detail of the interaction. He'd been in similar situations before. Luxury car dealerships where salespeople ignored him until he mentioned his budget, high-end restaurants where he was seated near bathrooms despite reservations made weeks in advance, and executive meetings where his ideas were overlooked until repeated by white colleagues. But this time was different. This time, he had power he hadn't disclosed. Several passengers were now openly watching the confrontation. One elderly white woman shook her head disapprovingly, though it wasn't clear whether her disapproval was directed at the Montgomerys or at Heather's treatment of them. A businessman 3 rows back had removed his headphones to listen. 2 college-aged girls whispered to each other, one discreetly pointing her phone toward the unfolding scene. I just don't understand why you're making such a fuss, Bradley interjected loudly enough for the entire cabin to hear. Some people just have to cause a scene wherever they go. The coded language wasn't lost on anyone. The Montgomerys were being painted as troublemakers, aggressive, unreasonable, and disruptive, simply for insisting on seats they had rightfully purchased. Kevin Garcia, the younger flight attendant, finally approached Heather and spoke quietly. "Heather, I checked the manifest. They are assigned to those seats." Heather shot him a warning glare. "Stay out of this, Kevin. You don't understand how we handle these situations." "What situations exactly?" Zoe asked pointedly. Heather ignored the question, her attention drawn to the front of the plane where two airport security officers had appeared. She gestured them over with an imperious wave. As the security officers made their way down the aisle, passengers shifted in their seats. The confrontation was escalating beyond what most had expected for a simple seating dispute. "These are the passengers causing the disruption," Heather informed the officers, gesturing toward Isaiah and Zoe. "They've refused to comply with crew member instructions." The first security officer, whose name tag read Thomas Reynolds, was a tall black man with a military bearing. The second, a younger Hispanic woman named Diaz, stood slightly behind him. Officer Reynolds surveyed the situation, his trained eye taking in details others might miss. The Montgomerys' calm demeanor, the expensive watch partially visible under Isaiah's sleeve, Zoe's understated designer handbag. "What seems to be the problem here?" Reynolds asked, addressing the question to everyone involved rather than accepting Heather's framing. "These passengers are in Mr. Wilson's preferred seats and have refused to relocate despite," Heather began. "We have confirmed tickets for these exact seats," Isaiah interrupted calmly, showing his boarding pass. "The flight attendant is trying to move us to accommodate another passenger's preference, not because of any actual seating issue." Officer Reynolds examined the boarding pass on Isaiah's phone, then looked more closely at Isaiah himself. A flicker of recognition crossed his face. "Sir, aren't you Isaiah Montgomery? From Montec?" The question sent a visible jolt through Heather. She quickly looked back and forth between the security officer and Isaiah, her certainty suddenly wavering. Before Isaiah could respond, a new voice entered the conversation. "Excuse me, coming through." A sharply dressed Asian man in his 40s made his way down the aisle. Marcus Chen, Executive VP of Operations at Pinnacle Airways, had arrived in response to Zoe's text. "Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery," Marcus said with a respectful nod. "I apologize for the confusion. Is there a problem with your seating?" Bradley Wilson stood up abruptly. "Hold on. Who are you?" "Marcus Chen, Executive Vice President of Operations for Pinnacle Airways," he replied without looking at Bradley. Mrs. Montgomery messaged about a situation developing on board. Heather's face had drained of color. "You know these passengers?" Marcus fixed her with a steady gaze. "Yes, Ms. Bailey. I know them quite well." He turned to the security officers. "Thank you for responding, but there's been a misunderstanding. Everything is under control now." Officer Reynolds nodded, clearly processing the implications. "Of course, Mr. Chen. We'll step back. I'd like to speak with the captain," Marcus said to Heather, whose professional demeanor had completely evaporated, replaced by visible anxiety. "The captain is preparing for takeoff," she stammered. "I think he'll want to address this situation personally," Marcus insisted. As Marcus spoke with Heather, Bradley Wilson attempted to slip away to the lavatory, suddenly very interested in avoiding the spotlight. Isaiah watched him go, making a mental note to address his behavior later. While they waited for the captain, Isaiah reflected on how familiar this scene was, not just to him, but to generations of Black Americans who'd been told they didn't belong in certain spaces. He remembered his mentor, Vernon Taylor, one of the few black executives in tech during the 1990s, describing being mistaken for janitorial staff in his own office building. He remembered Zoe telling him about presenting her revolutionary fuel system design to a room of aerospace executives who asked her if she was there to take lunch orders. They had promised each other long ago that if they ever gained real power, they would use it to create change. Not just for themselves, but for everyone who came after them. Zoe reached over and squeezed his hand, a gesture that communicated volumes between them. They'd experienced countless microaggressions together, had strategized and supported each other through discrimination both blatant and subtle. This moment, uncomfortable as it was, represented exactly why they had purchased the airline. By now, several passengers had recognized the Montgomerys, and whispers spread through the cabin. Some were discreetly searching the couple's names on their phones, eyes widening at the results. Kevin Garcia stood awkwardly nearby, clearly distressed by the situation but unsure how to make amends for not intervening earlier. The tension in the cabin shifted as Captain Gerald Foster emerged from the cockpit, his expression serious as Marcus briefed him quietly near the galley. The captain's eyes widened, and he looked toward the Montgomerys with a mixture of surprise and alarm. Bradley Wilson had returned from the lavatory and was attempting to gather his belongings without drawing attention. The power dynamic had shifted dramatically, and everyone in the first-class cabin could feel it. Captain Foster approached the Montgomerys, extending his hand. "Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery. I had no idea you were aboard today. Welcome to Pinnacle Airways, or should I say, welcome to your airline." The collective gasp from nearby passengers was audible. Heather Bailey froze, her face a mask of horror as the full reality of her actions began to sink in. "Your airline." Heather Bailey's voice was barely above a whisper, her face ashen as she processed the captain's words. Captain Gerald Foster stood straight back before Isaiah and Zoe Montgomery, his airline cap tucked under his arm in a gesture of respect. "Yes, Ms. Bailey. Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery acquired Pinnacle Airways 3 months ago. The formal announcement was scheduled for next week, following their evaluation period." The first-class cabin had fallen completely silent. Every passenger was now openly staring at the unfolding drama, many with phones discreetly recording. The revelation that the black couple Heather had tried to remove from first class actually owned the entire airline was too shocking for anyone to pretend disinterest. Have you ever witnessed someone realize they've made a catastrophic error in judgment? Comment number 1 if you've ever seen someone's face when they discover they've disrespected the very person who signs their paychecks. Like and subscribe if you believe the Montgomerys handled this situation with incredible grace. What would you have done if you were in their position? Would you immediately fire an employee who showed such blatant discrimination, or would you take a different approach? Officer Thomas Reynolds, who had recognized Isaiah earlier, now looked at the couple with newfound respect. "I apologize for the disturbance, Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery. If you need anything further from security, please don't hesitate to ask." "Thank you, Officer Reynolds," Isaiah replied, his deep voice carrying natural authority despite its measured tone. "I appreciate your professional approach to the situation." Marcus Chen, the executive VP, turned to Heather, whose shock was giving way to visible panic. "Ms. Bailey, we'll need to discuss this incident in detail after the flight." Bradley Wilson, who had been trying to make himself invisible since the arrival of Marcus Chen, now attempted to slink toward the exit row. Isaiah's voice stopped him cold. "Mr. Wilson, isn't your seat somewhere else? Since you were so concerned about assigned seating, I'm sure you'll want to find your actual seat." Bradley turned, his face flushed with embarrassment. There seems to have been a misunderstanding. I normally sit." "Your assigned seat is 4C, Captain Foster interjected, checking the manifest. "Not anywhere near Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery." The businessman fumbled for words. "I didn't realize, had I known who they were." "That's precisely the problem, isn't it?" Zoe spoke up, her voice calm but incisive. "The way people are treated shouldn't depend on whether they're recognized as important or powerful." A few passengers nodded in agreement. One woman in the back of first class actually applauded briefly before catching herself. Isaiah's mind flashed back to a pivotal moment early in his career. He'd developed a revolutionary security algorithm but couldn't get meetings with major tech companies to present it. After dozens of rejections, his mentor Vernon Taylor, one of the few black executives in Silicon Valley at the time, had made some calls. Suddenly, doors opened. The same companies that had ignored Isaiah's emails were now eager to meet. The algorithm hadn't changed, only the perception of who was behind it had. Zoe had experienced similar barriers in aerospace engineering. Despite graduating top of her class from Stanford, she'd watched white male classmates with lower GPAs get fast-tracked into prestigious positions while she fought for entry-level opportunities. It wasn't until her fuel efficiency system won a major industry award that companies began actively recruiting her, the same companies that had previously told her she wasn't a good fit. These weren't isolated incidents but part of a pattern they'd both experienced throughout their lives and careers. The airline acquisition was, in many ways, their response to these patterns, a chance to create change from a position of ownership. Kevin Garcia, the younger flight attendant who had hesitated to intervene earlier, now stepped forward. "Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery, I want to apologize for not speaking up sooner. I knew something wasn't right about how you were being treated." Isaiah nodded acknowledgement. "Thank you, Kevin. It takes courage to acknowledge when something's wrong." By now, passengers were openly using their phones, undoubtedly sharing the story on social media. The incident would likely go viral before the plane even took off, a public relations crisis unfolding in real time. Captain Foster cleared his throat. "Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery, we're scheduled for departure in 15 minutes. Would you like to proceed with the flight, or should we delay to address this situation more thoroughly?" Isaiah and Zoe exchanged glances, communicating silently in the way long-married couples often do. "We'll proceed with the flight, Captain," Isaiah decided. "But I'd like a word with the crew before takeoff." "Of course, sir. We can use the forward galley for privacy." As Isaiah and Zoe rose to follow the captain, the first-class cabin erupted in hushed conversations. Passengers who had pretended not to notice the discrimination now discussed it animatedly. Some expressed outrage on the Montgomerys' behalf, while others worried about potential delays to their travel. Bradley Wilson had finally found his actual seat and was hunched over his phone, likely calling his assistant to research who exactly the Montgomerys were and how this encounter might affect his business interests. Heather Bailey followed the Montgomerys and the captain to the galley, her entire body tense with apprehension. Her career flashed before her eyes, 15 years of service potentially ending in disgrace because she'd revealed biases she usually kept better hidden. In the narrow confines of the forward galley, Captain Foster gathered the flight crew. Kevin stood at attention, while two other flight attendants who had been working in economy looked confused about the emergency meeting. "I want to be clear about something," Isaiah began, his voice level but authoritative. "My wife and I bought this airline because we believe in its potential. We believe in the people who work here. But what happened today is exactly the kind of experience that drives customers away and damages reputations." Zoe added, "For the past 3 months, we've been flying on Pinnacle Airways routes anonymously, evaluating the customer experience firsthand. What we found is a pattern of inconsistent service that often breaks down along racial and socioeconomic lines." Heather's face crumpled. "Are you going to fire me?" The question hung in the air. Every employee present knew that the owners would be fully justified in terminating Heather on the spot. Her actions had been discriminatory, unprofessional, and now very public. "That depends," Isaiah replied carefully, "on whether you're capable of understanding why your behavior today was problematic, and whether you're willing to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem." As the crew meeting continued, passengers speculated about what was happening. Some expected Heather to be escorted off the plane in disgrace. Others wondered if the flight would be cancelled entirely. What no one expected was what happened next, a decision that would transform not just this flight, but the entire company culture in ways no one could have anticipated. When Isaiah and Zoe Montgomery emerged from the galley conference with Captain Foster and the flight crew, the tension in the first-class cabin was palpable. Passengers who had been freely speculating about Heather Bailey's imminent firing fell silent, watching expectantly as the group returned. To everyone's surprise, Heather was still there, though her usual confident demeanor had vanished. She looked shaken, her eyes red-rimmed as though she'd been fighting tears. Captain Foster addressed the cabin with formal authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we proceed with our departure to Chicago, I'd like to make an announcement. It is my privilege to officially welcome aboard Mr. Isaiah and Mrs. Zoe Montgomery, the new owners of Pinnacle Airways." A murmur rippled through the cabin, confirming what many had already suspected or overheard. "As some of you may have witnessed, there was an unfortunate incident during boarding today," the captain continued. "On behalf of the entire Pinnacle Airways family, I extend our sincere apologies to Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery and to any passengers who were made uncomfortable by what transpired." Bradley Wilson shifted awkwardly in seat 4C, attempting to make himself invisible as several passengers glanced his way. His earlier swagger had evaporated completely, replaced by the demeanor of someone wishing the floor would open and swallow him whole. Isaiah stepped forward, his presence commanding attention without raising his voice. "My wife and I appreciate Captain Foster's words. We want to assure everyone that we take today's event seriously, not because of our position as owners, but because every passenger deserves respect regardless of who they are or what they look like." Zoe added, "For the past 3 months, we've been flying on various Pinnacle routes incognito, experiencing our airline as ordinary passengers would. Today's incident, while unfortunate, provides an important opportunity for transparency and growth." A woman in 5B raised her hand tentatively. "Are you saying this has happened before?" Zoe nodded. "Not this exactly, but yes, we've observed inconsistencies in how different passengers are treated. It's one of the reasons we decided to acquire Pinnacle. We saw both problems and potential." Isaiah's mind traveled back to his first business-class flight years ago, when he'd saved for months to upgrade for an important meeting. He remembered the flight attendant who had repeatedly asked to see his boarding pass, the subtle expressions of surprise when he ordered wine instead of beer, the way his white seatmate had been addressed by name while he remained, "Sir," throughout the 6-hour journey. More recently, he and Zoe had documented similar experiences on various airlines. Being the last to receive service, having their carry-ons questioned when identical bags carried by white passengers went unchallenged, being mistaken for staff rather than first-class passengers. These weren't isolated incidents but data points in a larger pattern they intended to change. "We believe in addressing problems directly," Isaiah continued. "That's why we're having this conversation now, rather than pretending nothing happened or handling it behind closed doors." Kevin Garcia, who had earlier failed to intervene, now stepped forward. "As part of the cabin crew, I want to personally apologize for not speaking up sooner. I witnessed what was happening and should have said something immediately." His public acknowledgement shifted the atmosphere in the cabin. This wasn't just about one flight attendant's actions but about a culture that had allowed discrimination to go unchallenged. Heather Bailey, looking as though every word cost her considerable effort, spoke next. I want to apologize to Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery. My behavior was unprofessional and reflected biases I didn't fully recognize I held." Her voice trembled slightly. "There's no excuse for how I treated you." The apology was clearly difficult for her, and while it didn't erase what had happened, the effort was noticeable. Isaiah nodded in acknowledgement, neither dismissing nor fully accepting the apology yet. Meanwhile, flight attendants in the economy section were fielding questions from curious passengers who had caught wind that something significant was happening up front. Social media was already buzzing with partial accounts of the incident, some accurate and others embellished. One of the college students who had been recording earlier raised her hand. "Mr. Montgomery, are you going to implement changes at Pinnacle because of this?" "Absolutely," Isaiah replied without hesitation. "Not just because of today, but because our vision for this airline has always included creating an inclusive culture where every passenger feels valued. Marcus Chen, who had been quietly observing, added, "The Montgomerys have already begun developing comprehensive training programs and accountability measures that will roll out company-wide in the coming weeks." Captain Foster checked his watch. "Ladies and gentlemen, we need to prepare for departure. We're currently running 20 minutes behind schedule, but we'll do our best to make up time in the air." As the crew moved to their departure positions, Bradley Wilson raised his hand timidly. "Excuse me, would it be possible to be moved to another seat? Perhaps in economy? I'd be happy to switch with someone." His transparent attempt to distance himself from the situation was met with a few barely concealed scoffs from nearby passengers. "You'll remain in your assigned seat, Mr. Wilson," Captain Foster stated firmly. "We're past the point of making seating changes." As the cabin prepared for takeoff, Isaiah and Zoe settled back into their seats, the very ones they had been told to vacate earlier. The dynamic had shifted so dramatically it was almost dizzying. Passengers who had studiously avoided eye contact during the confrontation now smiled at them warmly or nodded respectfully. Heather, following whatever instructions she'd received during the galley conference, was now working the economy section while Kevin had taken over first class. The change was subtle but significant, a first consequence for her actions that stopped short of public dismissal. As the plane finally pushed back from the gate, Zoe leaned over to whisper to Isaiah. "Phase 1 of our evaluation is definitely complete." He smiled slightly. "And Phase 2 begins now." What neither of them said aloud, but both understood perfectly, was that today's incident had accelerated their timeline. The changes they'd been planning to implement gradually would now need to happen much more quickly. The incident would inevitably go public, and their response would define not just their leadership but the future of Pinnacle Airways itself. As the plane taxied toward the runway, passengers throughout the aircraft whispered about what they'd witnessed or heard. By the time they reached cruising altitude, the story would likely be trending on social media. By the time they landed in Chicago, it would be a full-blown PR situation requiring immediate and decisive action. The Montgomerys had prepared for various scenarios when planning their undercover evaluation of the airline. But nothing had prepared them for becoming the actual subjects of the discrimination they'd set out to address. The personal had become professional in the most public way possible. The true test of their leadership was just beginning. 3 hours after landing in Chicago, Isaiah and Zoe Montgomery sat at the head of a long conference table in Pinnacle Airways regional headquarters. The emergency meeting had been hastily arranged by Marcus Chen, who now sat to Isaiah's right, reviewing data on his tablet. On the other side of the table, Heather Bailey sat with her hands clasped tightly together, her earlier defiance replaced by subdued anxiety. Beside her was Diana Washington, Pinnacle's HR director. A polished woman in her 50s who had initially expressed skepticism about systemic issues when Marcus briefed her on the situation. Captain Gerald Foster sat further down, alongside Kevin Garcia and several other crew members from the flight. At the far end of the table, looking increasingly uncomfortable, was Bradley Wilson. The Montgomerys had specifically requested his presence, despite his multiple attempts to excuse himself for pressing business matters. "I appreciate everyone making time for this meeting on short notice," Isaiah began, his deep voice carrying effortlessly across the room. What happened today on Flight 2187 was not just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of deeper issues within Pinnacle Airways, issues that we intend to address head-on. Zoe tapped her tablet, and a screen on the wall illuminated with graphs and charts. "For the past 3 months, we've been collecting data on passenger experiences across all Pinnacle routes. We've flown as first-class passengers, economy passengers, and everything in between. We've varied our attire, our traveling companions, and our behavior. The patterns we've found are concerning." The screen displayed a heat map of customer satisfaction scores broken down by demographic categories. The disparities were unmistakable. White passengers reported consistently higher satisfaction than passengers of color, even when controlling for cabin class and route. This doesn't necessarily mean discrimination, Diana Washington interjected, her tone professionally skeptical. There could be multiple factors influencing these satisfaction gaps. You're right that correlation doesn't prove causation, Zoe acknowledged. That's why we didn't stop at surveys. She swiped to the next slide, showing a breakdown of customer complaints filed over the past 2 years. Complaints about unfair treatment are 3 times more likely to come from passengers of color. Complaints about excessive scrutiny of compliance with baggage policies are 5 times more likely. And when we look at how these complaints were handled. The next slide showed resolution rates. Complaints from white passengers were resolved favorably 78% of the time. For passengers of color, that number dropped to 43%. Isaiah watched Diana's expression shift from skepticism to concern as the data accumulated. This was why he and Zoe always led with numbers, they were harder to dismiss than anecdotes. We also conducted structured observations, Isaiah continued. On identical routes, white passengers in first class received unprompted offers of pre-flight beverages 94% of the time. For passengers of color, that figure was 56%. Heather Bailey stared at the table, her face flushed. These weren't abstract statistics, they represented real people she and her colleagues had treated differently without even realizing it. Mr. Wilson, Zoe addressed Bradley directly, causing him to startle visibly. Our records show you filed 8 complaints about seating arrangements in the past year alone. In 6 of those instances, you requested that other passengers be moved to accommodate your preferences, despite not having reserved the seats in question. Bradley shifted uncomfortably. I'm a loyal customer who flies weekly. I simply expect certain accommodations. And were these other passengers typically people who looked like you? Isaiah asked quietly. The question hung in the air. Bradley didn't need to answer, his silence and averted gaze spoke volumes. Kevin Garcia raised his hand tentatively. May I speak frankly? Isaiah nodded encouragingly. This isn't just happening on one route or with one crew, Kevin said, his voice gaining confidence. I've witnessed similar situations across the network. Sometimes it's subtle, which passengers get greeted by name, who gets offered the full beverage selection versus just the basics, whose carry-ons get scrutinized. Most of us don't even realize we're doing it. And when we do notice, added a flight attendant named Clarissa Jones, there's no clear process for addressing it. If I report another crew member for differential treatment, it's seen as creating drama rather than upholding standards. Diana Washington was taking rapid notes now, her earlier skepticism replaced by focused attention. Our complaint system doesn't currently track these kinds of issues specifically. We have categories for service failures, but not for potential bias incidents. Isaiah thought about his mentor, Vernon Taylor, who had faced similar challenges in the tech industry decades earlier. Vernon had described how isolation worked as a control mechanism, making each person of color feel like their negative experiences were individual problems rather than systemic patterns. Breaking that isolation through data and shared experiences had been key to Vernon's strategy for change. I want to share something personal, Isaiah said, his voice quieter but no less authoritative. When I started Montech, I couldn't get meetings with investors. My emails went unanswered. My calls weren't returned. It wasn't until I hired a white friend to pitch as the face of the company that doors started opening. Zoe nodded. And when I presented my fuel efficiency designs to aerospace manufacturers, I was repeatedly told they were interesting but impractical. 6 months later, when I submitted the exact same designs through a male colleague, they were hailed as innovative and visionary. These experiences aren't unique to us, Isaiah continued. They reflect broader patterns that many people of color face daily. What makes Pinnacle Airways different isn't the existence of these patterns, it's what we choose to do about them now that they've been identified. Diana leaned forward. I've been with this company for 12 years. If these problems are as widespread as your data suggests, why haven't they been addressed before? Sometimes we don't see problems we're not looking for, Zoe replied. And sometimes people who try to raise these issues aren't heard. She pulled up another screen showing crew assignment patterns across the network. The data revealed subtle but consistent segregation. Certain routes and shifts had significantly higher percentages of white crew members, while others had disproportionate numbers of crew members of color. "I didn't do this," Diana protested, looking genuinely disturbed by the pattern. "No single person did," Isaiah agreed. "That's what makes systemic issues so challenging, and so important, to address. They exist beyond individual intentions." Captain Foster, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "I've been flying for Pinnacle for 17 years. I've always prided myself on treating everyone with respect. But looking at this data, I have to acknowledge that I've sometimes turned a blind eye to problems I should have addressed." Heather Bailey finally looked up from the table. "Am I going to lose my job?" she asked directly, her voice strained but controlled. The question brought the room to silence. Everyone knew that her behavior on the flight would have justified immediate termination, especially given that the targets of her discrimination were literally the owners of the company. Isaiah considered her question carefully before responding. "Ms. Bailey, what happened today was unacceptable. It violated company policies, FAA regulations regarding passenger rights, and basic human decency." Heather nodded slightly, her expression resigned. "However," Isaiah continued, "firing you would be the easy solution, not necessarily the right one." Confusion flickered across several faces around the table. "If we simply terminate your employment, the narrative becomes about one bad apple being removed. The systemic issues remain unaddressed. The cultural problems continue. And nothing fundamentally changes." Zoe leaned forward. "What we're more interested in is whether you're willing to be part of the solution. Whether you can acknowledge the biases that influenced your behavior, work to change them, and help others do the same." The proposition hung in the air, an unexpected lifeline where career execution had seemed inevitable. I would like that opportunity," Heather said carefully, as if each word might shatter the fragile chance being offered. Bradley Wilson, who had remained silent through most of the meeting, suddenly stood up. "This is absurd. You're turning a simple seating misunderstanding into some kind of social justice crusade. I've been a loyal Pinnacle customer for years, and I don't appreciate being vilified for expecting certain standards." Isaiah regarded him calmly. "Mr. Wilson, no one has vilified you. We've simply presented data, including your own pattern of complaints and requests. If acknowledging that pattern makes you uncomfortable, that's something worth reflecting on." "I don't need to reflect on anything," Bradley snapped. "What I need is for my status as a valued customer to be respected. If Pinnacle no longer prioritizes its premium travelers, perhaps I should take my business elsewhere." "That's certainly your prerogative," Zoe replied evenly. "But I wonder, would you be equally comfortable on another airline if your request to displace other passengers from their assigned seats was declined there as well?" Bradley flushed deeper, grabbed his briefcase, and headed for the door. "My attorney will be in touch about today's humiliation." After he left, a palpable release of tension rippled through the room. "Well," Marcus Chen said dryly, "I think we've just witnessed Exhibit A of the customer-side contribution to our cultural issues." A few nervous chuckles broke the tension, but Isaiah quickly refocused the group. "Let's not minimize the challenges ahead. Changing culture is one of the hardest things an organization can do. It requires commitment at every level, consistent accountability, and a willingness to have uncomfortable conversations like this one." Diana Washington, who had been quietly processing throughout the meeting, finally spoke up with newfound conviction. "I want to acknowledge that I've been part of the problem by not seeing the problem. As HR director, I should have been tracking these patterns and addressing them proactively. I failed in that responsibility, and I'm committed to doing better." Her candor shifted something in the room. One by one, other leaders began acknowledging their own blind spots and failures of leadership. Captain Foster admitted to hearing discriminatory comments in the cockpit and letting them pass unchallenged. A senior flight attendant confessed to assigning crew members of color to less desirable routes to avoid customer complaints. These admissions, painful as they were, represented the first essential step toward meaningful change. The problems couldn't be solved until they were honestly acknowledged. As the meeting continued into the evening, the outlines of a transformation began to take shape. One that would challenge deep-seated assumptions, upset comfortable routines, and ultimately test whether Pinnacle Airways could become the company the Montgomerys envisioned. What no one in that conference room fully appreciated yet was how much resistance they would face, or how quickly the backlash would begin. The morning after the emergency meeting, Isaiah Montgomery stood at the window of his Chicago hotel suite, watching the sunrise illuminate the city skyline. Behind him, Zoe was already reviewing documents on her tablet, preparing for the day ahead. "The social media response is exactly what we expected," she reported. "The video from the flight has gone viral, over 3 million views already. Most comments support our handling of the situation, but there's a vocal minority calling it an overreaction." Isaiah nodded, unsurprised. "And internally?" Marcus says there's significant anxiety among staff. Some are worried about a purge, others about being publicly shamed for past behavior. The unions have requested an urgent meeting. The couple had anticipated this turbulence. Transforming company culture was never painless, especially when the catalyst was as public and dramatic as their confrontation with Heather Bailey. "We need to move quickly with the training program rollout," Isaiah said, turning from the window. "Not just sensitivity training, but structural changes to how service quality is measured and rewarded." Have you ever faced resistance when trying to create positive change? Comment number 1: if you've witnessed how organizations often protect the status quo, even when it's clearly flawed. Like and subscribe if you believe that transforming company culture requires more than just firing one person, it demands systemic change. What would you do if you suddenly had the power to transform a company from the inside out? Would you focus on punishing past offenders, or building a better future? 3 hours later, Isaiah and Zoe sat in Pinnacle's Chicago headquarters, facing a room full of airline executives. The tension was palpable. These were seasoned industry veterans being asked to acknowledge fundamental flaws in the company they'd built and managed. "The approach we're proposing has 3 components," Isaiah explained, standing beside a presentation screen. "First, a comprehensive audit of policies, procedures, and practices to identify where bias enters our systems. Second, revised metrics that measure equitable treatment alongside traditional service benchmarks. And third, an accountability framework that rewards inclusive behavior rather than merely punishing violations." Lawrence Edwards, a silver-haired board member with 40 years in the airline industry, shook his head dismissively. "With all due respect, Mr. Montgomery, airlines operate on razor-thin margins. We can't afford to divert resources to social experiments." "This isn't a social experiment, Mr. Edwards," Zoe replied firmly. "It's sound business strategy. Discrimination is expensive, it drives away customers, increases turnover, generates legal liability, and damages brand reputation. What happened on that flight was unfortunate," Lawrence conceded, "but it was one incident with one employee. Our customer satisfaction scores are well within industry averages." Isaiah pulled up the demographic data they'd presented in the previous day's emergency meeting. "Averages mask disparities, Mr. Edwards. When we disaggregate the data, we see significant gaps in experience based on race, gender, and other factors. Those gaps represent both moral failures and business inefficiencies." As the presentation continued, Isaiah outlined the comprehensive anti-racism training program they developed with leading experts in organizational psychology and diversity management. Unlike typical corporate diversity initiatives, this program included concrete accountability measures, structural changes to promotion pathways, and revised service protocols designed to ensure consistent treatment. Throughout the presentation, Isaiah thought about his mentor Vernon Taylor, who had faced similar resistance when advocating for change in the tech industry decades earlier. Vernon had taught him that transforming organizations required patience, persistence, and strategic thinking, qualities Isaiah was now drawing upon heavily. Meanwhile, across town, Zoe's innovative accountability metrics were being presented to Pinnacle's operations team. Unlike traditional customer satisfaction measures, these metrics specifically tracked consistency of service across demographic groups, identifying patterns that might otherwise remain invisible. The goal isn't to catch people doing something wrong, Marcus Chin explained to the operations team. It's to create systems where doing the right thing becomes the path of least resistance. Back at headquarters, the executive meeting had reached a critical juncture. Half the room seemed cautiously supportive of the Montgomery's vision, while the other half remained skeptical or openly resistant. "I still don't understand why we're not simply terminating Ms. Bailey and moving on," said Patricia Winters, the chief financial officer. "One decisive action would send a clear message without disrupting our entire operation." "Because this isn't about one person," Isaiah responded patiently. "Ms. Bailey's actions reflected biases that exist throughout our organization, and throughout our industry. Firing her would create the illusion of resolution without addressing the underlying issues. So instead, we reward bad behavior with special training." Lawrence Edwards interjected sarcastically. "No," Zoe said firmly. "Ms. Bailey has received a formal reprimand and been placed on probationary status. But we're also giving her an opportunity to be part of the solution. To help us understand how these biases operate and how we can effectively address them." As the debate continued, Isaiah received a text message from Heather Bailey herself, requesting a private meeting. The request surprised him. He hadn't expected her to take such initiative so quickly. Meanwhile, across the city, Bradley Wilson was meeting with his attorney, Spencer Hammond, a sleek corporate lawyer known for aggressive tactics. "They humiliated me in front of other passengers," Bradley fumed. "They implied I'm racist because I expect certain accommodations as a frequent flyer." Spencer Hammond nodded sympathetically while calculating potential angles. "The discrimination allegation gives us leverage, but their response was measured enough to make a lawsuit challenging. What might be more effective is controlling the public narrative. Positioning you as a loyal customer unfairly vilified by new owners pushing a political agenda. I want them to pay," Bradley insisted. "I've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars with Pinnacle over the years." "Oh, they'll pay," Spencer assured him. "One way or another." By late afternoon, Isaiah and Zoe met with Heather Bailey in a small conference room. The flight attendant looked different from the previous day, less defensive, more thoughtful, though still visibly anxious. "Thank you for meeting with me," she began. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since yesterday. At first, I was just terrified of losing my job. But after listening to the data you presented and reflecting on my own behavior, I've started to recognize patterns I never noticed before." She paused, collecting her thoughts. "I've worked for Pinnacle for 15 years. I've always prided myself on providing excellent service. But when I honestly examine my interactions with passengers, I can see the inconsistencies. With white passengers, especially wealthy-looking ones, I go above and beyond. With others, I do the minimum required." "Recognition is an important first step," Zoe acknowledged. "But what made you request this meeting specifically?" Heather straightened her posture slightly. "I want to be part of the solution. Not to save my job, though I do want to keep it, but because I believe in this airline. If there's a way I can help other employees recognize what I'm just beginning to see in myself, I want to do that." Isaiah studied her carefully, looking for signs of insincerity or strategic self-preservation. What he saw instead was something more valuable, the beginning of genuine reflection. "There will be resistance," he warned her. "Change is uncomfortable, especially when it challenges people's self-image as fair and unbiased." "I know," Heather nodded. "I've already experienced some of it. Several colleagues have reached out to commiserate, assuming I'm being unfairly targeted. They don't see the problem either. Later that evening, Isaiah and Zoe faced their own moment of philosophical disagreement. In their hotel suite, they debated the best approach moving forward. We need to move faster, Zoe argued. The momentum from this incident gives us leverage to implement changes that might otherwise take years of incremental steps. But rushing could create more resistance, Isaiah countered. People need time to process and adjust, especially when it involves examining their own biases. Time allows problems to be buried, Zoe reminded him. Remember what happened at Tech Fusion when they tried the gradual approach? By the time they implemented actual changes, the momentum was gone and everything reverted to the status quo. Their debate was interrupted by an urgent call from Marcus Chen. You need to see this, he said gravely. He sent them a link to a newly published article in a prominent business journal. The headline read, New airline owners push political agenda, alienate valuable customers. The article, clearly influenced by Bradley Wilson's perspective, characterized the Montgomerys as opportunistic activists using their wealth to advance social justice causes at the expense of business fundamentals. It quoted anonymous industry experts predicting that Pinnacle's value would plummet under the new ownership. It's starting, Isaiah said quietly. Zoe nodded, her expression resolute. So is our response. What neither of them fully appreciated yet was how quickly the resistance would organize, or how deeply entrenched the problems were within Pinnacle's corporate structure. The challenge ahead would test not just their business acumen but their relationship, their values, and their vision for what the company could become. As they prepared for the next day's battles, a larger question loomed: could meaningful change be created within existing systems, or would those systems inevitably reassert themselves against the forces of transformation? The answer would emerge in the coming days, as opposition to their vision crystallized into something more coordinated and determined than either of them had anticipated. 1 week after the flight incident, Isaiah Montgomery stood in his temporary office at Pinnacle Airways headquarters, scanning an anonymous internal memo that had been circulating among employees. The document, titled Preserving Pinnacle's Professional Standards, criticized the new ownership for imposing political correctness at the expense of customer service and creating a culture of fear where employees walk on eggshells. This was inevitable, Marcus Chen commented, setting down his coffee. Change always triggers backlash, especially when it challenges long-standing norms. Isaiah nodded, unsurprised but nonetheless concerned. How widespread is the sentiment? Hard to gauge precisely, Marcus replied. But there's a vocal minority actively resisting the new initiatives. Some senior staff have begun holding unofficial meetings after hours. The resistance had materialized faster than anticipated. Within days of announcing their comprehensive reform plan, the Montgomerys had encountered opposition from multiple directions. Board member Lawrence Edwards was rallying other executives against what he termed disruptive social engineering. Bradley Wilson and his attorney Spencer Hammond had launched a publicity campaign painting themselves as victims of reverse discrimination. And now, an internal faction was forming to undermine implementation of the new policies. Most troubling was how Heather Bailey had been repositioned in this emerging narrative. Rather than being seen as someone who had displayed clear bias, she was being portrayed by the resistance as a scapegoat, a dedicated employee unfairly targeted for enforcing standard protocols. Despite her own acknowledgement of problematic behavior, she was being unwittingly transformed into a symbol for those resisting change. Heather called this morning, Marcus reported. She's uncomfortable with how she's being characterized by both sides of this debate. Some colleagues are treating her like a martyr, while others see her as the face of the problem. Isaiah sighed. The human complexity of organizational change was always more challenging than the technical aspects. We need to meet with her again. She could be a powerful ally if she's willing to speak authentically about her own journey. Across town, Zoe Montgomery was facing her own challenges. She had discovered disturbing patterns in crew assignments that suggested deliberate segregation, routes serving predominantly white, affluent communities were staffed almost exclusively by white crew members, while routes to more diverse destinations had disproportionately high numbers of crew members of color. "This can't be coincidental," she told Diana Washington, the HR director who had become an unexpected ally. "These patterns are too consistent across too many variables." Diana nodded grimly. "I've been reviewing historical staffing data. The segregation has actually increased over the past 5 years, corresponding with changes in the scheduling algorithm implemented under the previous leadership." "An algorithm can't be biased unless humans make it that way," Zoe noted, her engineering background informing her skepticism about neutral, technical solutions. Meanwhile, Kevin Garcia, the flight attendant who had hesitated to intervene during the original incident, had found his own voice. He had organized a support group for minority staff members, creating a space where they could share experiences and strategize solutions. What had begun as informal conversations was evolving into a structured advocacy group within the company. "For years, we've individually experienced these problems but had no collective voice," Kevin explained during a meeting with Isaiah. "Now people are finally speaking up because they believe something might actually change." Not everyone welcomed this new openness. That afternoon, Isaiah received word that several senior staff members were threatening to resign if the political agenda continued. One executive had explicitly stated that he didn't sign up to work for a social justice organization. The opposition was becoming more coordinated. Spencer Hammond, Bradley Wilson's attorney, had contacted other frequent flyers with histories of complaints against minority staff, encouraging them to share their concerns about declining service standards with the media. A social media campaign with the hashtag #BoycottPinnacle was gaining traction among conservatives who viewed the Montgomery's reforms as evidence of woke capitalism. "They're trying to make this about politics rather than professionalism," Zoe observed during their evening strategy session. "It's a deliberate tactic to undermine the business case for change." Isaiah nodded. "And it's working with some stakeholders. Lawrence Edwards has been meeting privately with board members, arguing that our approach will alienate valuable customers and damage shareholder value." The most troubling development came the following morning, when Zoe received a tip from an administrative assistant about a secret executive meeting planned for that afternoon. The meeting, deliberately scheduled when the Montgomerys would be in external meetings, was intended to discuss strategies for moderating the ownership's reform agenda. "They're plotting to dilute our initiatives," Zoe realized. "They'll outwardly agree while finding ways to maintain the status quo." Making a quick decision, Zoe rearranged her schedule and attended the meeting, arriving just as it began. The expressions of shock when she walked into the conference room would have been comical under different circumstances. "Please, don't let me interrupt," she said calmly, taking a seat at the table. "I'm very interested in hearing strategies for implementing our reform agenda more effectively." Lawrence Edwards recovered quickly. "Mrs. Montgomery, this was simply a preliminary discussion about operational impacts. We were going to brief you and Mr. Montgomery once we had a clearer picture." "How considerate," Zoe replied, activating the recording app on her phone without drawing attention to it. "Please, continue with the agenda as planned." The discomfort in the room was palpable, but with Zoe present, the executives had little choice but to proceed with a sanitized version of their discussion. Even this watered-down conversation, however, revealed troubling attitudes and resistance strategies that might otherwise have remained hidden. Later that evening, when Zoe played the recording for Isaiah, his expression darkened. "They're not just disagreeing with our approach. They're actively working to undermine it while presenting a cooperative face." "Listen to this part," Zoe said, forwarding to a specific timestamp. Lawrence Edwards' voice emerged clearly from the recording. "The key is to appear supportive while building in enough procedural hurdles that the more radical elements never get implemented. If we can delay the major changes for a few quarters, the Montgomerys will likely move on to other priorities. This is just the enthusiasm of new ownership, it always fades once they confront operational realities." The recording confirmed what they had suspected but couldn't previously prove. a coordinated effort to resist meaningful change while maintaining plausible deniability. As the week progressed, the challenges multiplied. The media coverage, initially supportive of the Montgomerys' response to discrimination, had become more mixed as the narrative shifted toward business impacts and employee concerns. Financial analysts were raising questions about whether the new ownership was prioritizing social issues over profitability. Even some allies were beginning to question whether the pace of change was too aggressive. For Isaiah, the situation triggered painful memories of earlier career obstacles. He recalled losing a major contract early in Monteca's history when a potential client expressed concerns about a cultural fit, a thinly veiled reference to his race. He remembered how investors had questioned his company's growth potential despite strong performance metrics, suggestions that made little sense until he recognized the underlying biases at work. For Zoe, the resistance echoed her experiences in aerospace engineering, where her innovative designs were often met with technical objections that mysteriously disappeared when presented by male colleagues. The dynamics were different, but the underlying pattern was familiar. Those benefiting from existing systems rarely relinquished privilege willingly. By Friday afternoon, the situation had reached a crisis point. The company seemed increasingly divided between change advocates and resistors. Implementation of key policies was stalling amid bureaucratic delays and procedural concerns. The social media campaign against Pinnacle was gaining momentum, potentially threatening bookings and revenue. And several board members were privately discussing whether to challenge the Montgomerys' leadership more directly. Isaiah and Zoe faced a moment of doubt about their approach. Had they moved too quickly? Should they have built broader consensus before implementing changes? Was meaningful transformation even possible within existing corporate structures? Maybe we were naive, Zoe admitted during a rare moment of uncertainty. We thought ownership would give us the power to create change, but the systems of resistance are more entrenched than we anticipated. Isaiah considered this thoughtfully. Or maybe this resistance is exactly why our approach is necessary. If change were easy, it would have happened already. As they contemplated their next steps, both recognized that they had reached a critical juncture. The forces of resistance had consolidated and revealed themselves. Now they needed to decide whether to retreat, compromise, or advance more boldly despite the opposition. What they couldn't yet see was how their response to this crisis would not only determine Pinnacle's future but potentially transform the entire industry's approach to discrimination and inclusion. 3 days after discovering the executive resistance plot, Isaiah Montgomery stood before a packed auditorium at Pinnacle Airways headquarters. Every seat was filled, flight attendants in uniform, pilots with captain's stripes, baggage handlers still in their high-visibility vests, corporate staff in business attire. The company-wide town hall had been announced only 24 hours earlier, yet attendance was nearly universal, a testament to the tension and uncertainty permeating the organization. "Thank you all for being here today," Isaiah began, his deep voice steady and measured. "I know there are many questions, concerns, and yes, fears about the changes happening at Pinnacle Airways. Today, I want to address those directly and clarify our vision for this company's future." The audience was noticeably divided, some leaned forward attentively, while others sat with arms crossed, expressions skeptical or openly hostile. Lawrence Edwards and his faction of resistant executives occupied a row near the back, their body language broadcasting disapproval. "When my wife and I acquired Pinnacle Airways, we didn't do so as a vanity project or a social experiment," Isaiah continued. "We did so because we recognized a company with tremendous potential that wasn't being fully realized. Today, I want to make the business case for why our reform initiatives are not just morally right but strategically essential." With that introduction, Isaiah launched into a meticulously prepared presentation. Rather than focusing on discrimination as a moral failing, he framed it as a business inefficiency. An operational flaw that damaged customer experience, employee retention, and ultimately, profitability. "Every inconsistency in service represents wasted resources," he explained, displaying data visualizations that quantified the costs. When passengers of color receive slower service, when they're subjected to additional scrutiny, when they're made to feel unwelcome, those aren't just ethical problems. They're customer experience failures that drive away business and generate negative word of mouth. The screens displayed compelling financial analyses. Companies with strong diversity and inclusion metrics outperformed industry averages by 36%. Airlines specifically showed 28% higher customer loyalty when service consistency ratings were high across demographic groups. This isn't speculation, Isaiah emphasized. These are hard numbers that directly impact our bottom line. Discrimination isn't just wrong, it's expensive. As the presentation continued, Isaiah addressed the resistance directly, without antagonism but with unflinching clarity. I understand change is uncomfortable. I understand that examining long-standing practices and uncovering unconscious biases can feel threatening. But I want to be clear, these reforms aren't about assigning blame or making anyone feel guilty. They're about building a stronger, more profitable, more sustainable business that truly serves all our customers. The energy in the room was shifting, some of the crossed arms had uncrossed, some of the skeptical expressions had softened into thoughtful consideration. Isaiah was connecting with the pragmatists in the audience, those who might not be moved by moral arguments but responded to business logic. Then came the moment that transformed the meeting from persuasive to pivotal. Zoe Montgomery stepped forward, tablet in hand. Before we proceed further, there's something important that needs to be addressed, she began. It has come to our attention that some members of the executive team have been actively working to undermine the very initiatives they publicly claimed to support. A ripple of murmurs spread through the audience. Lawrence Edwards shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Rather than engaging in open, honest dialogue about concerns, these individuals have held secret meetings, developed strategies to sabotage implementation, and deliberately misled both ownership and staff about their intentions. Zoe activated a screen displaying a transcript of the recorded meeting she had infiltrated. Key sections were highlighted. Lawrence explicitly discussing delay tactics, another executive suggesting ways to contain the damage until this blows over, a third strategizing about how to manage the Montgomery's expectations down to something realistic. The audience reaction was immediate and visceral. Gasps, widened eyes, heads turning toward the executives in question. Lawrence Edwards half rose from his seat, face flushed, before thinking better of it and sitting back down. We value transparency and honest disagreement, Zoe continued calmly. What we cannot accept is sabotage and deception. Effective immediately, those who participated in these efforts will be placed on administrative leave pending a full review. Security personnel discreetly appeared at the auditorium's exits, not threatening, but present. The message was clear, the resistance had underestimated the Montgomerys' resolve and preparation. As the initial shock rippled through the room, an unexpected voice spoke up. Heather Bailey rose from her seat in the middle of the auditorium. "May I say something?" she asked, her voice wavering slightly but determined. Isaiah nodded, curious about what the flight attendant might contribute to this charged moment. Heather took a deep breath. "Most of you know me, and many of you know about what happened on Flight 2187. What you might not know is how that experience has changed me." She paused, visibly gathering courage before continuing. "I've worked for Pinnacle for 15 years. I've always thought of myself as a fair person who treated everyone equally. When I was confronted with evidence of my own biased behavior, my first reaction was denial and defensiveness." The auditorium was absolutely silent now, hundreds of people hanging on every word. But as I reflected honestly, I had to acknowledge patterns I'd never noticed before. How I make assumptions about passengers based on their appearance, how I offer different levels of service without even realizing it, how I enforce rules selectively. These weren't conscious choices, but they were real, and they affected real people. Heather turned to face different sections of the audience as she spoke. "Some of you have treated me like a victim in all this, and I appreciate your support. But the truth is, I wasn't victimized, I was held accountable. And that accountability has been the most valuable professional development I've ever received. Her candor seemed to break something open in the room. The defensive energy that had permeated the gathering began to dissipate, replaced by something more reflective and receptive. Building on this momentum, Isaiah introduced the next phase of the meeting, the unveiling of Pinnacle's new executive leadership team. One by one, talented professionals from diverse backgrounds took the stage, each bringing impressive credentials and fresh perspectives to key roles. Some were internal promotions of overlooked talent, others were strategic external hires who shared the Montgomery's vision. These leaders were selected not because of their demographics but because of their excellence, Isaiah emphasized. Their diversity of experience and perspective is an asset that will drive innovation and growth. Meanwhile, across town, Bradley Wilson was receiving disappointing news from his attorney. Spencer Hammond looked distinctly uncomfortable as he explained the situation. "The lawsuit isn't viable, Bradley. We've reviewed the video evidence, interviewed potential witnesses, and consulted with experts in discrimination law. The Montgomery's response was measured and appropriate. More problematically for our case, your own history of complaints against minority staff members creates a pattern that would be difficult to explain in court. So they just get away with humiliating me?" Bradley demanded, face flushing with anger. "From a legal perspective, you weren't humiliated, you were prevented from displacing passengers from their assigned seats, which they had every right to occupy. I strongly advise against proceeding with litigation." As Bradley fumed, the media narrative was already shifting. Journalists who had initially amplified the woke capitalism angle were now investigating the exposed executive resistance. Business publications that had questioned the Montgomery's approach were now featuring analyses of the financial benefits of consistent, bias-free customer service. Industry observers were beginning to frame Pinnacle's transformation as innovative leadership rather than political activism. Even competing airlines were taking notice. Within days, several carriers had announced reviews of their own service consistency metrics and training programs. The conversation was expanding beyond Pinnacle to the industry as a whole, exactly as the Montgomerys had hoped. Back at the town hall, Isaiah was concluding his presentation with an invitation rather than a mandate. Transforming Pinnacle isn't something ownership can impose from above. Real change happens when every person in this organization makes daily choices that align with our values and vision. We're not asking for perfection, we're asking for commitment to the journey. He paused, looking out at the sea of faces, some inspired, some still wary, most somewhere in between. The choice before each of you is simple but significant. Will you be part of building the new Pinnacle Airways, or will you cling to ways of operating that no longer serve our company, our customers, or our future? As the town hall concluded, Isaiah and Zoe were approached by Kevin Garcia, who had been instrumental in organizing support among staff members. "That was transformative," Kevin said, still processing the meeting's dramatic developments. "I've never seen anything like it in my career." "It's just the beginning," Zoe replied. "The real work happens after speeches and presentations, in daily interactions, in policy implementation, in consistent accountability." Indeed, as the days passed, tangible changes began taking root throughout the organization. Diana Washington led a comprehensive overhaul of HR practices, implementing blind resume reviews and structured interviews that reduced hiring bias. The crew scheduling algorithm was reprogrammed to eliminate the segregation patterns Zoe had identified. Customer feedback systems were redesigned to capture and address consistency issues across demographic groups. Most significantly, the company culture began to shift. With the most resistant executives removed and clear support from ownership, employees who had previously stayed silent about discrimination began speaking up. Constructive conversations replaced defensive reactions. Learning replaced denial. 6 weeks after the town hall, financial reports showed an unexpected development. Despite the controversy and social media campaign, Pinnacle's bookings had increased by 12%. Customer satisfaction scores were trending upward across all demographic categories. Employee retention had improved, particularly among staff of color who had previously left at higher rates. What had begun as a crisis sparked by one discriminatory incident was evolving into a case study in transformative leadership, proof that addressing bias wasn't just ethically sound but strategically smart. For Isaiah and Zoe Montgomery, the early results were encouraging but not surprising. They had always believed that excellence and equity were complementary rather than competing values. Now they were demonstrating that principle in one of the most challenging corporate environments possible. As they prepared for the next phase of Pinnacle's transformation, they reflected on a wedding vow they had made to each other years earlier. A promise to use whatever success they achieved to create opportunities for others. That private commitment was now manifesting on a scale neither could have imagined when they first exchanged those words. The resistance hadn't disappeared entirely. Change never proceeds without opposition, but its power had diminished significantly. What remained was a growing momentum toward a new vision of what an airline could be, and by extension, what any company could become when it truly committed to serving all its customers equally. 6 months had passed since the infamous Flight 2187 incident. On a crisp autumn morning, Isaiah and Zoe Montgomery boarded Pinnacle Airways Flight 2187, the same route, the same flight number, but a profoundly different experience. As they approached the gate, they were greeted by name, not because they were the owners, but because this level of personalized service had become standard for all Pinnacle passengers, regardless of appearance or background. The gate agent, a young woman named Tasha Wilson, efficiently verified their boarding passes while maintaining warm, genuine eye contact. "Welcome aboard, Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery. We're honored to have you flying with us today," she said, her tone professional but not deferential. "We're running exactly on schedule for our 10:15 departure to Chicago." The transformation was immediately apparent as they entered the aircraft. The cabin crew, led by a familiar face, Heather Bailey, welcomed passengers with consistent warmth and attention. Gone was the subtle coding of who deserved premium service and who didn't. Instead, each interaction reflected the company's new core value: excellence for everyone, every time. Heather, now trained as an inclusion ambassador, had undergone a remarkable personal and professional evolution. After her powerful speech at the town hall 6 months earlier, she had volunteered to help develop the airline's reformed service protocols. Her first-hand experience with recognizing and addressing her own biases made her uniquely qualified to guide others through similar journeys. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery," Heather greeted them with genuine warmth rather than the anxious deference that might have been expected given their history. "Your seats are ready. May I get you a pre-flight beverage once you're settled?" As they moved toward their seats, Isaiah noticed something subtle but significant. Heather was providing identical service to all first-class passengers, regardless of race, age, or apparent wealth. The consistency was remarkable not because it was exceptional, but because it had become normal. Taking their seats, the very same 2A and 2B that had been the center of controversy 6 months earlier, Isaiah and Zoe exchanged knowing glances. The memory of that confrontation remained vivid, but instead of reopening wounds, it now served as a measure of how far they had come. As the cabin filled, they observed the crew in action. Kevin Garcia, now head of cabin crew training, moved through the aircraft with quiet confidence, modeling the techniques he taught in Pinnacle's revolutionary, Consistent Excellence program. New hires shadowed experienced crew members, learning not just procedures but mindsets and approaches that ensured every passenger received the same high standard of service. In a delicious twist of irony, Isaiah noticed a familiar face boarding the plane: Bradley Wilson, the entitled businessman whose demands had triggered the original confrontation. Bradley appeared momentarily startled upon seeing the Montgomerys, then quickly averted his gaze and hurried past first class toward his seat in economy. Following the incident, his corporate account had been flagged for review based on his history of complaints against minority staff, and his executive platinum status had been revoked pending completion of a customer expectations workshop. "Some lessons are learned the hard way," Zoe murmured, noticing Bradley's discomfort. Isaiah nodded. The goal was never punishment, though. It was change. And change had indeed come to Pinnacle Airways. Just last week, the company had received the industry's prestigious Phoenix Award for Most Improved Customer Experience, an honor that recognized not just enhanced service but the comprehensive transformation of company culture. Satisfaction scores had risen across all demographic groups, with the historic gaps between white passengers and passengers of color narrowing to statistical insignificance. As the plane reached cruising altitude, Isaiah reflected on the journey from discrimination victim to change agent. Growing up on Chicago's South Side, he'd experienced countless moments of being made to feel he didn't belong in certain spaces. From being followed by security in upscale stores to being questioned about his presence in first-class lounges, the message had been consistent: some places weren't meant for people who looked like him. Now, as owner of an airline, he'd had the power to challenge those unspoken rules, not just for himself, but for everyone who came after him. The thought brought a quiet satisfaction deeper than any business success he'd previously achieved. Meanwhile, Zoe's aerospace expertise had found unexpected application in the airline's operations. Her mentorship program for minority aerospace students had become a pipeline for diverse talent into Pinnacle's technical operations. Young engineers who might otherwise have been overlooked were now bringing fresh perspectives to aircraft maintenance, fuel efficiency, and flight operations. "Excuse me," a hesitant voice interrupted Isaiah's reflections. He looked up to see an elderly black woman standing in the aisle beside their row. "Are you the Montgomerys? The ones who bought this airline?" "Yes, we are," Zoe confirmed with a warm smile. "Can we help you with something?" The woman, who introduced herself as Eleanor Thompson, was in her 80s. Her eyes glistened as she spoke. "I've been flying since the 1960s. For most of my life, I was made to feel unwelcome on planes, seated near lavatories regardless of my ticket, watched suspiciously by flight attendants, questioned about my first-class tickets as if they must be mistakes. Today was the first time in all my years of travel that I truly felt respected from the moment I stepped on board." She reached out her weathered hand to grasp Isaiah's. "I just wanted to thank you. What you've done here matters more than you know." The encounter left Isaiah momentarily speechless. It brought to mind his first flight as a child, a trip to visit relatives in Atlanta where he'd observed his mother being treated dismissively by the cabin crew despite her careful preparation and meticulous adherence to all rules. That memory had stayed with him through decades of success, a reminder of injustices still unaddressed. As Eleanor returned to her seat, Diana Washington approached from the front of the cabin. Once skeptical of systemic issues, the HR director now led an industry task force on inclusive practices, sharing Pinnacle's transformation model with other airlines and transportation companies. The quarterly diversity metrics just came in, Diana reported quietly, sliding into the empty seat across the aisle for a brief conversation. Passenger satisfaction is up 32% overall, with the gap between demographic groups now less than 3%, within the margin of error. Employee retention has improved 47%, and applications from qualified candidates of color have tripled. "Those are encouraging numbers," Isaiah acknowledged. "But the stories like Mrs. Thompson's tell us more than statistics ever could." As the flight continued, other passengers occasionally approached to express appreciation or share their own experiences. What struck Isaiah most was how the transformation had benefited everyone, not just those who had previously experienced discrimination. White passengers commented on the improved consistency and professionalism, business travelers noted enhanced efficiency, families appreciated the more welcoming atmosphere. Excellence, when truly universal, lifted all experiences. Near the end of the flight, Captain Foster's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our initial descent into Chicago O'Hare. On behalf of the entire Pinnacle Airways team, I want to thank you for flying with us today." After the standard announcements, he added something personal. "Today's flight is special for our airline. Exactly 6 months ago, an incident on this very route became the catalyst for profound change throughout our company. That change hasn't always been easy, but it has made us better, as professionals and as people. We're grateful to our owners, Isaiah and Zoe Montgomery, for challenging us to become the airline you experience today. The announcement was met with spontaneous applause throughout the cabin. Even Bradley Wilson, still nursing his wounded pride in economy, offered reluctant acknowledgement with a slight nod when a nearby passenger commented on the improvements. As the plane touched down in Chicago, Isaiah and Zoe exchanged a look that communicated volumes without words. The transformation of Pinnacle Airways represented something larger than corporate change. It demonstrated how power, when used purposefully, could create ripples of improvement far beyond its immediate application. "We did it," Zoe said simply as they taxied toward the gate. "We started it," Isaiah corrected with a smile. "This is just the beginning." And he was right. The changes at Pinnacle were already inspiring similar transformations at other airlines and in other industries. Companies that had dismissed diversity initiatives as peripheral were now studying the Pinnacle model as a blueprint for operational excellence. The business case for equity was becoming impossible to ignore. As they prepared to disembark, Heather Bailey approached one final time. "Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery, thank you for flying with Pinnacle Airways today." Her words were the standard script, but her eyes conveyed a deeper message: gratitude for the second chance, for the opportunity to be part of meaningful change rather than an example of what went wrong. Isaiah nodded in acknowledgement. "Thank you, Heather. It was an excellent flight." As they walked through the terminal, Zoe reflected on a quote that had guided much of their work: "Transformation requires courage from unexpected places." The courage had come from many sources, from Heather confronting her biases, from Kevin finding his voice, from Diana questioning her assumptions, from employees at all levels choosing change over comfort. The true victory wasn't just in the improved metrics or industry recognition, but in those countless individual choices to do better, to see more clearly, to create space for everyone to belong. That was the transformation that mattered most, the one that would endure long after this particular story faded from public memory. What would you do if you suddenly found yourself in a position of power? Would you use it to address systemic problems, even when doing so brings resistance and criticism? Have you ever witnessed discrimination transform into understanding through honest conversation and accountability? Comment below with your thoughts, like this video if you believe in creating spaces where everyone is treated with equal respect, subscribe for more stories of justice and transformation, and share this with someone who needs to understand that change is possible when people are brave enough to create it. Thank you for watching this story of how one confrontation on an airplane became the catalyst for company-wide transformation. Remember that change often begins in unexpected moments, and any one of us might be the person who makes it happen. This story reminds us that true transformation requires more than just removing one bad apple. It demands addressing the underlying systems that allow discrimination to thrive. The Montgomerys could have simply fired Heather and moved on, but they recognized that lasting change comes from confronting uncomfortable truths and creating new structures that promote equity. Power, when wielded with wisdom, can break cycles of injustice that have persisted for generations. Isaiah and Zoe used their position not for retribution but for reformation, understanding that punishing individuals without changing systems only perpetuates the problem in different forms. Perhaps most importantly, this story shows that addressing discrimination isn't just morally right, it's good business. By ensuring consistent excellence for all customers, Pinnacle Airways improved satisfaction, increased loyalty, and enhanced their reputation. The business case for equity is compelling when measured in dollars and cents, not just in principles and values. Real change happens when those with privilege recognize injustice and stand against it, when those who have been marginalized find their voices, and when organizations value consistency and fairness as core operational priorities rather than peripheral concerns. The journey is never easy or straightforward, but as Pinnacle Airways discovered, the destination is worth the turbulence along the way. Have you ever witnessed discrimination transform into understanding through honest conversation and accountability? Or have you been in a situation where speaking up could have made a difference? Your experiences matter in this important conversation. Comment below with your thoughts on how you would handle discrimination if you witnessed it. Would you have the courage to speak up like Kevin eventually did, or would you remain silent? Like this video if you believe in creating spaces where everyone is treated with equal respect and dignity. Subscribe for more powerful stories about standing up against injustice and creating positive change in the world around us. Share this with someone who needs to understand that transformation is possible, whether they're in a position of power who can create change, or someone experiencing discrimination who needs hope that things can improve. Thank you for being part of this conversation. Remember, every small action against discrimination creates ripples that can eventually become waves of change.